everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for the virtual book launch for Alberta Quiltmakers and Their Quilts by author Lucy Hines. I'm Heather Kitteringham, and I'm on the board of Friends of Royal Alberta Museum Society, or FRAMS for short. We would like to recognize that we are webcasting from and to many parts of Alberta. Alberta is located on Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory and is a traditional meeting ground and home for many Indigenous peoples. FRAMS respectfully acknowledges that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others. We acknowledge the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who have lived on and cared for these lands. We make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and gratitude. Acknowledging traditional territory is just one part of recognizing the ongoing impacts of colonization while working together in decolonization and committing to reciprocity in our relationships. As we listen to the discussion this evening, we can think about what it has meant and what it means today to be a quilt maker on these lands. Joining us this evening is Lucy Hines, the author of Alberta Quiltmakers and Their Quilts and the acting curator of daily life and leisure at the Royal Alberta Museum. Lucy began researching the history of Alberta quiltmakers and quilts in 2010. The first 3 years of the Alberta Quilt Project was spent surveying Alberta quilters to capture 21st century quilting trends. For the following 6 years, Lucy engaged 38 museums throughout the province to host public quilt documentation events to help capture the history of quilts. The research collected through this process informed her book, Addressing the Gap in Canadian Literature on the History of Alberta Quilts. Lucy will be in conversation with Tricia Carlton, FRAMS board member and curator of the City of Edmonton Heritage Collection. Alberta Quiltmakers and Their Quilts is proudly published by FRAMS. We are a registered charity and not-for-profit membership organization. FRAMS supports the Royal Alberta Museum in a variety of ways, most importantly through telling Alberta stories. From sponsorship to artifacts, we now add publishing to the list of things we do. We are delighted to announce that Lucy's book is on sale now in the RAM Museum shop. Purchase your copy in person or online today at frams.ca/book. We welcome you to become a FRAMS member and gain access to a year of fun events, discounts, and unlimited admission to the museum. You can visit frams.ca to find out how to get involved. Okay, before we get going, I have a few housekeeping items to quickly mention. You'll see that along the bottom of your screen, there is a chat button. Please feel free to use the chat window to make comments. You can also reach out to FRAMS support in the chat window if you have any tech issues. You'll also see a Q&A button along the bottom menu bar. If you have questions you'd like to ask Lucy, please enter them there as we go into the Q&A window. Closed captioning is available. There's an option to activate or deactivate it along the bottom menu bar. And just to let you know, we're recording this event, and in the next few days, the recording will be available to view on our FRAMS YouTube channel. At the end of the talk, you'll see a brief 5-question survey in your web browser. We would really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to provide us with your feedback. And that's it for housekeeping items. Please enjoy your evening. I'm going to pass things over now to Tricia Carlton.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here this evening. So I will be leading us through some questions for Lucy. And if you have any questions for Lucy, as mentioned before, just put them in the Q&A box and I will try to pick up on some of those throughout. We'll also have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation as well. So welcome, Lucy. The first thing I would like to know is, how did your interest in quilts begin?
Well, I was always interested in anything that was textiles, fabrics, sewing. I started sewing my own clothes when I was about 11, but I did not come from a family that made quilts, not close family or extended family. My first, I think that my first recollection of quilts was on a family trip to Lancaster County in Pennsylvania to an Amish community. And I would have been about 6 years old at the time. And it had really left an impression on me. And I do remember seeing quilts on their beds. And then later on, I think I was in my early teens, and my mother and father had a quilt made for their bed by the Mennonites in St. Jacobs, from St. Jacobs area in Ontario. And I decided that I was going to make myself my own quilt. And so I purchased my own fabric, and I had cut up all the squares. In those days, you were using scissors. So it was a lot of work, but I never did make the quilt. That's as far as I got. And then in my 20s, I had 2 children at the time, and I made 2 quilt tops with the intent of making quilts for their beds. And the quilt tops was as far as I got. And so it took many years before I got to actually complete quilts. And it really wasn't until I started having grandchildren. And all of a sudden I thought, no, I need to start making quilts. And that would have been about 16, 17 years ago that I started making quilts. When I started working at the Royal Alberta Museum in 2008, I discovered that they had a wonderful quilt collection. And so, of course, that was of interest to me, and discovered that there had been some research done in the 1980s. The curator at the time was working on a quilt exhibit. And so there was research that took place during that year. And I noticed that there was a catalog that had been made for that exhibit. And I noticed that in the catalog, there were some quilts that are now in our collection, and they were not in our collection at the time of the exhibition. So it was the beginning of the museum's actively collecting quilts. They did have approximately 20 quilts in their collection at that time. We're now getting close to about 150 quilts in our collection. But certainly that exhibition sort of kickstarted the museum actively collecting quilts.
Right. Well, I'm sure it will be comforting to many of our quilters out there listening that you are not immune to the UFO phenomenon. That is the unfinished objects, which you can read about in the book, of course.
That's right.
And so you've talked a bit about how the Royal Alberta Museum kind of got into actively collecting quilts. So tell us a little more about how, especially the quilts that you feature in the book, like how those came to be in the collection, and how that works. How do things get donated to the museum, or how do they collect these things?
Right. So we collect quilts that were initially brought by settlers, so they weren't necessarily made in Alberta, but certainly when settlers first came, they brought quilts with them. So we like to collect anything that's related to the settlers' effects. And we also like to collect quilts that are primarily made in Alberta that tell a story. We are very much into collecting stories. We don't collect quilts just for the sake of collecting quilts. We will collect quilts if we are looking for a particular technique. Maybe Jessica, if you can bring up the first slide, it will show a couple of quilts. Yes. So these would have been some quilts that we were in the first exhibition and are now in our collection. And so because they were, one was made by a First Nations woman, Rosie Davis. The other one was a husband and wife team, and they actually won, this was a prize-winning quilt for the Canada Packers competition that they had in the 1980s. So these are some quilts that tell, wonderful stories about quilting and the quilt makers. But there are also techniques, like right now, actually, one thing that we don't have in our collection is quilts that really highlight the long arm machine quilting that is being done nowadays. So it's very contemporary, but we really don't have any quilts that that show us that technique. And so that will be something that, we would be looking at collecting.
Nice. I'm going to bring in, there's a question in the Q&A. Lucy, do you come to quilt guilds for truck shows? Which
for truck shows, I have been. I used to actually be a member of the Edmonton and District Quilt Guild for a number of years. I live out in the country now. I'm about an hour west of Edmonton, and I am finding that it's just difficult to get into, to be part of guilds. But I have a couple of local guilds around here, but they only meet in the daytime. So once I retire, I will definitely be joining some of the local quilt guilds that are in existence.
Excellent. And that actually ties in nicely with getting into your project of documenting quilts all around Alberta through your role with the museum. And so tell us kind of about your process for documenting quilts, because this project was far beyond the quilts that are in the museum collection. And so tell us about how you were prompted to go out into all these communities and how you did that.
Well, one of the things that I realized that I had to do was to, in order to capture the history of the early quilt makers especially, was to find quilts that would especially be in private collections. Quilts that are in museums. Unfortunately, often some of our early quilts, including the Royal Alberta Museum, were quilts that did not necessarily have a story. They were quilts that were donated because family members had no real connection to them. And so they thought, the museum would like them. And that's the case with most museums in Alberta. When I was documenting quilts that belonged to the collections of museums, there was not a lot of information. So it was, how was I going to reach the families that kept their quilts, that had the story? So I partnered with 38 different museums throughout Alberta, as well as the local quilt guilds, so that we could put on an event where we would invite the public to bring in their quilts to be documented. So these were usually 2 days events. So the first day we would be documenting the museum's quilts, and that served as training for the local quilters who would be assisting me with the documentation, so that when the following day, when we were open to the public and documenting their quilts, we were prepared and everybody knew what their role was. I always had one individual who would be collecting the history of the quilt maker by talking to the quilt owner. Often that would be a daughter or a granddaughter. And then the others would be, there would be scribes and who would be writing down all the information that we collect by examining the quilts. So there was 2 parts. One was collecting the history, and the other one was actually looking at the quilts and we had a form that we would follow to, how many stitches to the inch and what fabrics were used and what were the quilt patterns, that sort of thing. So I was able to, through my project, I was able to document just a little over 700 quilts. And what I didn't know when I first started the Alberta Quilt Project was that there had been another documentation project that took place during the 1990s, 1992 to 1995. And once I was made aware of this, I was in contact with the individual who still retained all the files for the documentation and the photos. And she was willing to, was actually happy to donate all of those files to the Royal Alberta Museum so that they would be, in an institution that would be accessible to researchers in the future, and to have everything together. And so in 2012, we did receive those documentation files, and the Alberta Heritage Quilt Project, which it was called, they had documented a little over 1,100 quilts during their three years. They were quite active during those 3 years. And then when I started my project about a year later, there was another group that was interested in studying Alberta quilts. And so they formed a group, the Alberta Quilt Study Society. They're mainly in Calgary, and they have been documenting quilts since that time, and have also documented over 750 quilts. And so what has been great is my book includes these documentation projects and really help to round out the information. For one thing, my project stopped at 1970. I would only document quilts pre-1970 because there was a resurgence in quilting after the 1970s, and chances were likely that I would end up getting a lot of more contemporary quilts. And I really wanted to be able to tease out the older quilts that were in existence in Alberta. So with my project, my quilts stopped at 1970. So with the Alberta Heritage Quilt Project and the Alberta Quilt Study Society, they helped to fill the gap. And so I was able to include their quilts for the latter part of the 20th century.
Nice. So that's great that with the projects together, you end up covering a large span of time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And, I'm sure that, trends with quilts kind of change over time, but some of the elements kind of stay the same throughout. And I thought maybe we could chat a bit about some of the basic vocabulary about quilts. For some of our audience out there may not be quilters. And I know when I was new to quilts, working with you, it took me a little while to get all the vocab down. So if you could chat to us about the sort of the characteristics of quilts and the words that you use to describe them.
Right. So Jessica, if you can bring up the slide, I have a couple of examples. We often talk about quilt blocks, and so the quilt that's on the left, we see that there is a repeating pattern throughout. And so these are the one pattern would be considered a block. So you can see at the top, there's 4 blocks across and there's 5 blocks down. So it has a total of 20 blocks in the quilt. And then when we talk about a quilt top, it's when we put all these blocks together, and it is the top of the quilt. So a quilt will have a top, it will have a fill, and then it will have a backing. And so the fill is sandwiched between the top and the backing. The quilt fill or the batting is nowadays we buy the batting by the roll. And it could be cotton, it could be wool, it could be polyester, it could be a combination of fabrics. They're coming up with bamboo now as well. When we talk about quilting, like there's quilts as being the noun, the bed cover, but there's quilting as the verb, and that would be the stitching that we use to keep the three layers together. So the quilt on the right really sort of shows the grid pattern of a hand quilted baby quilt. There is also tying quilts, and that would be where you would literally usually it was yarn, you would just sort of, put a needle through the three layers and bring it back up and just tie it, as opposed to actually quilting. And that was done mostly, well, one, if you had a large family and many beds, this was a quick and dirty way to get the quilts put together, because hand quilting takes a lot of time. And sometimes the quilters, the need was to get the quilts on the beds. They had to be ready to use. So tying quilts was a good way to do that. But also, when you think of the Alberta winters and how cold they were, they would make really thick quilts. And often these quilts were too thick to actually be stitched using fine quilting stitches. So tying them made sense to do. Also, if you wanted to launder these quilts, they were very difficult to launder, but you could untie them. It was still a long process, but you would untie them, and usually one side of the quilt would have sort of a whip stitch, something that was easy to undo to take the fill out, and then you could take the cover, almost like a duvet cover, and throw it in the wash. And usually they would be washed, once a year. In some cases, I have had a couple of individuals tell me that their mothers or their grandmothers would actually also take the wool outside, sort of outside of the envelope of the top and the backing, and actually clean that again and card the wool, and then redo the fill before tying it back up again. So it's almost like redoing the quilt all over again, just in order to be able to launder the quilt. So those are the basic terms that may come up as I am speaking about quilts.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's a lot of work to keep the family warm with beautiful quilts.
It is.
But much appreciated by the recipients of the quilts, I'm sure. We've got a few more questions in the Q&A. So one was, how did you select the quilts that are featured in your book?
Oh, that was difficult, because there were approximately 2,500 quilts to choose from, and there's less than 200 quilts photos in the book. Firstly, it was the stories, which ones had wonderful stories, and there were a number of stories, and of course in the book there are 12 stories that are featured, and that was because the family members had sometimes diaries or unpublished memoirs that the Quiltmakers actually had written. So there was some really good information. There was also some wonderful archival photos that went along with these stories. And so, these ones certainly were able to be featured as sort of a major story about a quilt maker. The other thing that, as I was going through all the files, there were themes that developed, that it became really apparent that there were a lot of wedding quilts that were documented. There were a lot of prize-winning quilts that were documented. There were some quilts that were made by men, or men and wives. So as these topics, these themes develop, it sort of directed how the book would look. I didn't, decide, oh, I'm going to have a section on wedding quilts, or, the one that really surprised me was UFOs, unfinished objects, because in my mind, it seems to me that, this was an issue with modern quilters, 21st century quilters. We all have, you know, unfinished projects, but no, there were lots of quilts that it took a number of generations to get it completed. So the quilt top may have been started by a grandmother, and sometimes it skipped a generation. The daughter, you know, was given the quilt top and never did anything. And then it was the granddaughter who then either finished it or had it finished. And so I thought, oh, okay, there were a lot of unfinished quilts that were documented that were unfinished, originally unfinished objects. So that's how, you know, those themes came about. And because a lot of the quilts that were documented, you know, we got sort of snippets of information about the quilt maker. We're already looking at, you know, 2, 3, maybe 4 generations. And a lot of the history of the quilt maker has already been lost. But sometimes you find out that, you know, one quilt maker, she was perhaps the, you know, the first postmistress in Millet, or she was a teacher or a nurse. So there's bits about her life that I was able to capture while putting those quilts as part of the themes. And so that's how the quilt book evolved.
Excellent. Yeah, so I love how it's so just as much about the story as it is about the quilt object itself.
Right.
And with that, because a theme that's, I think, really strong throughout the book is how effective quilts are in communicating or transmitting family heritage. And so if you could speak to that, of what do you think it is about quilts that are so good at doing that and communicating a family's heritage through the generations?
Well, I think quilts have are more often than not made for family members. Certainly the earlier quilts, they were made for the family. And of course, the earlier quilts did not, quilters didn't purchase fabric, or very little. They used what was around, often sewing scraps, because often the quilt maker was making clothing for their family, and so they would use up the scraps to make their quilts. And then there was worn out clothes that would have been used to make quilts as well. So it was interesting to meet certain people who brought in their quilts to be documented and identify pieces of clothing that belong to a member of their family or their own clothing. I interviewed this one lady who helped her mother quilt. And when I interviewed this woman, Alice Wiki, she was 98 years old at the time. This would have been, I think, 2012. And she had quilted this particular quilt with her mother. She said she was not a quilter. She just helped her mother to quilt. And it has all sorts of sewing scraps that was used to make the quilt. And she could identify, she remembered that, you know, the various dresses that her mother had made her in the 1920s, because that's how old this, you know, this quilt was. And so there's this real connection of items that, you know, had belonged to individuals that made their way into their quilt. Quilts also document milestones in terms of wedding anniversaries. We documented many, you know, from the first wedding anniversary to the 10th, the 25th, the 50th, even a 60th anniversary quilt was made. And usually that was made by the quilt maker, usually as a gift for herself or sometimes for her husband. Also, the birth of a baby, the number of baby quilts that were made, you know, so there's always this certainly connection that helps tell the family story. But quilts are also documents, like they document other events, not necessarily family events, but, you know, people have made quilts to celebrate, you know, Alberta's 75th anniversary, 100th anniversary, or the town that they live in, if they were celebrating their 100th anniversary. There have been quilts that were made to document the celebration of in this case, a church, 100 years of that church, and to put in all of the brands of the different farming or ranching communities there, that you know, is telling of who was there at that time. The quilt on the left there is a little doll quilt that was made using ties, the recipient's grandfather's ties. So that also speaks to, you know, something that belonged to a family member, that, and she still had this doll quilt when she donated it to the museum many years later. So yeah, there's different ways that I think too, quilts, you know, just bring a lot of comfort. And the fact that even the person who made that quilt, you know, will sort of feel the warmth of the person that actually made the quilt.
Definitely. Yeah, I can agree. I've got my great grandmother's quilt beside me here right now. So not only do quilts, you know, pass on a lot of meaning within a family or for individuals, but they also, as you point out in lots of the stories in your books, can speak to like community efforts. And you know, for example, the Life by the Lake quilt by the Sea Beach Quilters, and many others draw attention to how quilters often give back to their communities. And so can you speak a little bit to the sort of quilting culture that you observed in Alberta, particularly with the generosity of quilters and quilt groups?
I think that was one of the things that really amazed me when I was traveling around Alberta and meeting with all these quilters. And, you know, when you're part of a quilt guild or a quilt group, or, you know, you're within your own community, you're doing activities within your own community, you're not seeing what everyone is doing. And I was able to sort of have a sort of a bird's eye view of like all these communities of quilters and all of their charity efforts that they were working on. And it was just truly amazing that every year, every community has some kind of project that they work towards in terms of raising money for a certain organization, or making charity quilts for organization that serve a certain population that would benefit from receiving a quilt for comfort. And the thing is, this is something that, you know, the Alberta Quiltmakers have been doing since the very beginning of Alberta's, you know, as the settlers arrived in Alberta, they were already, you know, making quilts to fundraise for schools or churches or hospitals. The quilt that you see on the left there was a signature quilt, and signature quilts were very common at the first quarter of the 20th century. People would pay 10 or 25 cents to have their signature placed on the quilt, and that's how they would raise money for a certain event. And this one was made by the Ladies' Aid Society of Partridge Hill, and it was for the Edmonton Public Hospital, who that then became the Royal Alexandra Hospital. And at that time, there was the Edmonton Public Hospital Auxiliary or Aid Society, and it was made up of 6 women, and they were responsible for for paying the hospital's mortgage, for paying for all the linen and supplies for the hospital, as well as the employees, like the doctors and nurses, their salaries. So it was a small group of women who were responsible for paying these individuals. And the hospital was a 25-bed hospital, so it was a smaller hospital, but still the fact that it remained to the responsibility of these women to raise funds. And so you had groups such as the Ladies' Aid Society of Partridge Hill, who sort of stepped up to the need of raising funds in order to pay the bills. What is interesting is there's a darker circle of like leaves that you can see, and it has Lord and Lady Minto's name on there. And at the time, the Duke and Duchess of Cornwall and York were visiting Canada, and Lady Minto took them out west to visit the West. And she would have been there at the time that the Partridge Hill quilters were collecting signatures to raise funds. And so she and her husband, who was also Canada's Governor General at the time, are placed on this quilt. So it's just a really an excellent example of how, what quilters were doing and continue to do to raise funds and provide comfort to others by making charity quilts. Also, if we go to the next slide, one of the big efforts that the Alberta quilters were involved in was making Canadian Red Cross quilts. And there was, during the First World War, quilters made lots of quilts, but they made signature quilts. So they were raising funds for the Red Cross so they could purchase medical supplies, ambulances, those types of things. But during the Second World War, there was a real need for comfort quilts to be sent over to England in particular, but other countries as well that may have been bombed out at that time. And so the Alberta quilters stepped up, and there were quotas that they had to meet every month. And within the 6 years during the war, Alberta quilters made 43,000 quilts, which is an incredible amount of quilts to have been made. And all were sent overseas. And this is probably the only one that exists in Alberta. I do know that there is one in Saskatchewan and one in Manitoba. And the only reason why we have this one is because a collector from England had collected this one. And because it had Alberta, Canada embroidered on the quilt, she felt that it needed to be returned to us in order for us to, capture that history. It was, quilters were not allowed to actually put their names on quilts. So it was rather clever that this group decided to put Alberta, Canada, to at least give the recipient a sense of where this quilt came from. The interesting thing that I learned was in 2016, I was in Bath, England, giving a talk about the documenting the contemporary Alberta quilters, the 21st century quilters. And
I think we've just had Lucy's internet is maybe just catching up there. While we wait for that, I was going to mention, I know you're getting to see some of the beautiful quilts in the photos here. And if you are interested in seeing some quilts live and in person, Frams is hosting what is called a bed turning event on March 25th and 26th at the Royal Alberta Museum. So keep your eyes out for that
Okay,
information. Oh,
sorry, I'm back. There was a disconnect there.
No worries.
So yes, so this research group, because the quilts were starting to surface or see the light of day because they had been in basements or trunks. They had an exhibit in London on the Canadian Red Cross quilts. So I was actually, a lot of my information about these quilts, I reach out to this group to tell me the history of the quilts that we made at that time. So yes, it's very interesting that there's a part of the Alberta quilters time in history where they were extremely prolific in making quilts, and we have very few of these quilts to tell that story.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question before we focus in on questions from our viewers tonight. So if you could tell us a bit about some of the quilters that you came to know, like in person or through the family stories that were passed on to you, and just kind of who were these people, who are the quilters of Alberta?
Okay, and Jessica, if you can bring up the quilt, there's a red quilt. There's two quilts, one is red. Yeah, that one, that's great. So I'll speak to three quilts in particular. The first one is the red quilt. It's a cigarette silk quilt, and it was made by Victoire Mercredi-Luty, who is a Métis woman from Fort Chipewyan. And she married John Luty in 1910 and lived in Fort Chipewyan, where John was the factor of the Hudson's Bay Company. And they had 7 children. Unfortunately, Victoire died prematurely of acute appendicitis at the age of 34. But she made this quilt using cigarette silks, and it would have taken her quite some time to actually collect the amount needed for this quilt. But John was probably the source of these cigarette premiums through his work trading at the Hudson's Bay Fort. The cigarette silks are very specific to the early part of the 20th century. They were usually made of satin, and they were very small rectangular inserts that fit nicely inside of a cigarette package. And these premiums were popular items to collect during the early 1900s. And the tobacco companies were certainly interested in attracting women to smoke. And this was an advertising strategy to meet their objectives. Now, whether women smoked or not, they did collect them as pieces to add to quilts. And we often see them as in crazy quilts. It's not often that you will see a full quilt with all of these premiums on them. So I don't know if John was a heavy smoker and was able to collect a lot of these, but it is very unusual to see a quilt with that many cigarette premiums in them. You'll have a pillow size, but not much more. And then the 2 baby quilts that are on the right, that was really interesting. So Lawrence Jackson made the first baby quilt while his wife, Ima, was bedridden during her pregnancy with their daughter, Penny. And each evening he would return home from working in the oil fields in Oklahoma and would prepare food for his wife and keep her company. And they would, play cards or board games. But if they weren't doing that, just chatting, then he would make a quilt. He was making the quilt. Now, when Lawrence's and Ima's daughter Penny was pregnant with her first child, they decided instead of just announcing that that she was pregnant, they said, we just decided to ask her father or tell him that it was time to make another quilt. And so the second quilt on the bottom was made for his grandson. So he used, more or less the same, basic pattern to make the baby quilt. But there wasn't very many quilts made by men that were documented. But even to have one that was made in 1939 and then another one by the same quilter by 1960. And I don't know that he was a prolific quilter. I think these might have been the only two quilts that he made. Yeah, it's just interesting to see a quilt that is made by a male quilter. And next slide, thank you. So this one is a wagon wheel quilt on your left. That was made by Lossie Lane, and it helps to tell the history of the early Black pioneers to Alberta. Lossie Lane had made this quilt for her dear friend Ivy Beaver, and they did not meet each other until their adult children married each other in 1950. But their experiences as early Black pioneers to Canada solidified their friendship. So the union of Ollie Lenora Lane and James Willis Beaver planted the seed that blossomed into a lifelong friendship. So Lossie and Ivy lived different lives in different communities, but both had moved far away from what had been their home in the United States to a new home in Canada. Lossie's friendship quilt is a testimony of that friendship, as noted in the inscription on the quilt to Ivy Beaver, "Remember me," from Lossie Lane, 1960. Lossie and her husband, Leander Lane Sr., and their eldest son, Leotis, traveled to Maidstone in Saskatchewan in 1912. And after Lossie's husband passed away from cancer in 1947, Lossie left Maidstone to live with her eldest daughter Rosie, in Edmonton. However, Lossie did spend every summer with her other daughter, Ollie, and husband James, and their children on the farm in the community of Tiger Lily, which is about 11 kilometers northwest of Campsie. And Lossie took residence on the top floor of the house, and there she would spend 6 to 8 hours a day, except for Sundays, hand stitching quilts. By the end of the summer, Lossie would have completed a batch of brand new quilts, and Christine, her granddaughter, who was very instrumental in providing me with Lossie's story, had said that every quilt on the beds at home were made by her grandmother. And it was during these summers that Christine learned to sew and make quilts. When Christine was 6 years old, her Granny Lane instructed her in the art of threading needles, and she would thread 5 to 10 needles at a time and leave them within reach of her grandmother's hands. And Christine remembers her grandmother calling out to her, she would give me 2 squares to stitch. And of course, Christine would want to, do them quickly and so that she could go out and play. But her Granny Lane would take one look at her stitches and tell Christine to rip it out and start again if it wasn't good enough. And Christine says that to this day, if it doesn't look right, I rip it out. And Christine has become an accomplished quilter due to spending so much time of her formative years with her grandmother. And we can see the lovely quilt to the right that she made. And interestingly enough, they both have a circle type motif, which is quite interesting.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all of those wonderful stories, Lucy. I'm going to pick some questions from the audience here. And this one I think is quite interesting. Now that quilts are mainly finished with long arm quilting, how does that relate to the quilt maker ownership? The finishing of the quilt should really be attributed to the long arm quilter.
I think it's a joint effort. You have the one individual that makes the quilt top and designs it pieces it together. And then you have someone else who quilts it on the long arm. When I first started doing this research, which, was during the 2010 to 2012, when I was documenting the contemporary quilters. And, long arm quilting is definitely a 21st century phenomena. Up until the year 2000, there wasn't very much long arm quilting that was being done, certainly not in Alberta. And I can remember the tensions that one could feel about, who did the quilt belong to, who does get recognition. And after I had done my research, I did give talks throughout Alberta. And one of the things that I would tell them was, I would talk to the fact that I didn't really understand, or not that I didn't understand, but didn't know much about long arm quilting. So I actually went and took a course on how to use the long arm, how to drive it. And it was actually kind of fun. I enjoyed it, but I've never actually gone back to using it for my own quilts. And while I was learning to use the long arm machine, it reminded me that, it used to be that you invited, 6 to 8 of your friends to come and help you to quilt it. So you would have made the quilt top, but you had many people's hands to assist you to put the quilt together. And so with the long arm machine, because you're not doing it by hand, you're just doing it by machine, that the long arm quilt maker really embodies those 6 to 8 people that would have helped you to get the quilt completed in a timely manner. And so when I would, sort of explain sort of my revelation as I was learning to use the long arm quilting machine, and I would sometimes get quilters come to me afterwards and say, thank you for, acknowledging that, I'm still a quilter, even though I did the top. And then I would get long arm quilters who would come and say, thank you for recognizing my work, because, a lot of people think it's not really quilting if your quilt is being done by a long arm quilter. So I think, it speaks to the times. We have busy lives. And I had made a quilt for my mother-in-law, and I was going to hand quilt it. And then I thought, are you kidding me? Like, she'll never get it. So I had a long arm quilter quilt it for me, and she got it in a very timely manner and enjoyed her quilt. So, and I think what we're also recognizing is when you go to quilt shows, the long arm quilters are now recognized as being part of making the quilt. So you'll often see 2 names. You'll have the one that made the quilt top, and you have the one that is who did the quilting. And now there are categories just for long arm quilters to highlight their skills as quilters, using the long arm quilting machine. And so I am seeing now that there's more of a partnership between the two, and to recognize that it's okay, we're creating quilts together, and we should embrace that.
And just quickly, Lucy, because I don't think we covered this in the vocab, what is a long arm quilting or long arm quilting machine?
It's a big machine. It takes up, I don't know, it's 8 feet. It actually looks like a traditional quilt frame, but it has the machine, like a sewing machine, that you actually move. So you actually stand up and you move the machine and create designs, and then you roll the machine or the quilts to get each part done, just as they would when they were hand quilting. You wouldn't necessarily have the whole quilt on able to see the whole quilt on the frame. It was rolled on either side, and as you got parts done, you would then roll up the parts that were completed and then continue on. So it's similar to that. Google it, you'll be able to see what a long arm machine is.
So another theme that came out in the book, and we have a question about, is what sort of items were used as batting for the quilts?
Yes, well, there's a whole chapter on that. And it was interesting, some of the things that I discovered. There was one, I think it was a daughter or granddaughter, who said that the quilt maker had stuffed quilts with newspaper. Now, these would have been quilts just to be used outdoors in carriages to keep them warm when they were, going to school. But it's not very serviceable to put, to use newspapers, but it's what they had on hand, and that's what was used. Certainly wool is very big in Alberta. I have a feeling we had a lot more sheeps on farms than we do today, because it seemed that many quilters were using their own wool from their sheeps, carded them, and then others, such as your grandmother, Tricia, who would send the wool off to a woolen mill in Carstairs, and then she would receive batting in return for her quilts. The quilters were ingenious. There was one quilt that I was able to actually deconstruct, had long wool underwear that had been deconstructed for one layer, and then there was deconstructed sweaters that was a second layer to provide warmth, and it was all stitched onto an old army blanket, which created additional warmth as well. So there's lots of different. Buffalo fur was also used, collected from the fence up at the Buffalo, I think it's up by Wainwright. There's a buffalo park there that's fenced in, and in the 1930s, the women, there were some women that went and they would collect the fur of the buffalo in order to use as stuffing for their quilt. Yeah.
Nice. So very resourceful.
Very
quilters
resourceful
out there.
Mm-hmm.
I think we'll just have time for one more question here. And I'll also just mention quickly, you'll see in the chat, there's information about our contest. So if you, like me, have a family quilt, take a picture of it and post it with us for a chance to win a prize. And the info's in the chat there. So this was actually kind of similar to a question that I had, but we didn't have time to get to. So thanks for audience asking it. In your research, did you uncover, sorry about the pun, themes, materials, techniques that changed over time? And what did that say about the time and the people who made them? So kind of the quilting themes over time.
Right. Yeah, well, yes, certainly there are certain quilts that we would never have made here in Alberta because they were of an earlier time period. And the reason we have them was because they were brought to us with the settlers. And so I know that there is, I don't know if Jessica can pull up that slide, but between the 1920s and the 1980s, chrome orange in quilts was very popular, and that was because of the discovery of chromium deposits in the UK, France, and the United States. So when we find quilts in our collections or that were documented that have chrome, or we call it cheddar orange, it speaks to a specific time period. And certainly during the 20th, no, that's not the one, Jessica, would be, that's the inside of quilts. There would be a quilt with orange in it, up higher, I think. Anyway, we might get to it. during the 19th century, definitely, it seemed to be colors were more the trend because of the dyes that were available at that time, as opposed to having patterns that were popular. Whereas in the 20th century, we find that patterns were more popular. So patterns such as the Sunbonnet Sue and the double wedding ring patterns that were available in the 1920s. And of course, we see them throughout the decades after that, the yo-yo quilts and the Dresden plate during the 1930s and 40s. So it seems like the patterns are more sort of the trends during the 20th century, and things come back, you know, like we talk about yo-yo quilts as being a novelty technique, which is really not novel. I mean, it was novel in the 1930s, but there, you know, was a resurgence where certain individuals were ambitious enough to want to make yo-yo quilts, which is very time consuming. And we're starting to see now crazy quilts, which was very popular during the Victorian era from, in particular, 1876 to the 1900s. And now there's a resurgence of crazy quilts that are being, you know, are making a comeback. So on the left side, you're seeing a crazy quilt. The Victorian ones have a lot of embroidery and embellishments on them. Alberta Quiltmakers were doing a lot of crazy quilts. Actually, it was the most popular quilt to make based on the quilts documented, but they usually only used the herringbone or the feather stitch and did not do it as embellishing the way they did during the Victorian era. And on the right hand side, that is a yo-yo quilt done with very fine yo-yos. It almost looks like icing in real life. You almost want to eat it. It's beautiful.
Wonderful. Well, we've reached the end of our time. And so I just want to say a huge congratulations to Lucy on the finishing of this beautiful book and for sharing stories from all over Alberta through your work. And thank you to everyone who has attended tonight. And there's more information in the chat if you're interested in purchasing the book or attending any of our upcoming events. And I will hand it over to Heather to wrap things up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Lucy and Trisha, and to our audience for those thoughtful questions. I really feel like I could just listen to you both for hours more, but in lieu of that, just a final reminder that you can win a free signed copy of Lucy's book, and the link, as Trisha mentioned, is in the chat window. In case you don't win, we encourage you to buy a copy. It makes a great gift, especially for yourself. Thank you all so much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.